You don't have to do.
Oh, I know.
But go ahead and take your time. Yeah.
Does it need to be good before we meet with you, or can we be working in progress? Like, are you marking it? Like, should I be like
it's not graded.
preempting the goodness of it, or I can just have it be
very
bad and
drafty
work
is
with
fine.
you?
Very
Okay.
drafty. Paragraph is good. It doesn't have to be in complete sentences. It can be very just speculative, or like here's some thoughts. It's no problem. I'll just give you feedback on whatever you send. I've already met with a few people just to give a little bit of suggestions, but again, I'll just remind you, it's a theory essay on theory. Your object is not literature or anything else, but theory really. So you're going to talk about Stuart Hall or Frederick Jameson or whoever you like in this syllabus as your main object. One thing that came up that I was talking with Maya was about it can be difficult if you pick on too big a topic. If you Samantha was talking, like, for example, the male gaze. That's actually a little bit more concrete. If you're talking about like vision, is very broad, or even the senses, even more broad. And people write books and books and books on these topics. They have also written books on the male gaze, but at least it's a little bit more focused, so that you can kind of come in there. And remember, we had this debate about, like, is there a female gaze, or is there several gazes now? So that's a viable theory question, and you can just take that on by talking about Laura Mulvey and Lacan. That's a theory essay, so that's totally fine. But it helped to have that little specific thing, as well as the bigger picture too. But a lot of times, better theory and also even better literary essays are based on a little bit more of a specific question. Lastly, I'll just remind you that, like, anything on literature is welcome, but you are theorizing literariness, or the function of literature, or maybe a little sense of like the form, or I'll also say, let's say, narratology, or poetics. All of these about, like, the big picture of that thing. So, but that doesn't mean you can't zoom in. So you can write a very fascinating essay on, like, metaphor and the role of metaphor in modernist aesthetics. In someone like even in Adorno or something like that, using Adorno as your main person. What are Adorno's metaphors, and how is he using the modernist aesthetic of metaphor in his sentences or something like that? So the object wasn't a work of art; it was Adorno, but I'm trying to get a specific thing that I might do the same thing with a poem, reading for metaphor, but here I'm reading it in the theory. So that's recommendations as you're thinking about your abstract. You don't have to theorize literariness; it's up to you. I do think it's a good thing, though, English department wise, but some people prefer other arguments or so on. So that's fine, but think about feel free to take on any theory question you want, any text you want, and as I have always said, you are the theorist, so you can decide what you think is theoretically interesting, and that's also a good place to start. A couple ways into the way of thinking about this paper, and then when you put on the abstract, I'll give you some feedback. So, the paper is going around. Sign in for a time slot. And we turn it over to Tina and Stuart.
I'm going to take on Stuart Hall cultural identity and diaspora today. He talks about how culture shapes our identity, having gradient as an example. So I'll break down the theory, starting with the question, what is cultural identity? So many people think that cultural identity is something fixed, it's simple, it's in our blood, like DNA or something. But Hall challenges this idea, and he contrasts his own idea, which is like identity more like in motion, it's like a process rather than a product, with a more common view towards cultural identity, which sees it as one shared culture, a sort of collective one true self, hiding inside the many other, more superficial and artificially imposed selves, which people with a shared history and ancestry hold in common. Hall calls this definition as being, because he sees it as a pre-accomplished, like constituted, And a good example of this is Arvid Francis. He says, Arvid Francis, just like Paul, is a Jamaican-born photographer who has been living in London for about, I don't know, more than 50 years, since the 50s. And what he does for a living is that he takes pictures of the people who live, like African people who live in diaspora. And one of his most famous project is the Black Triangle, in which he takes pictures or photos of people in US, like Malcolm X in Chicago, UK, a random teenager, and Johannesburg, which is in South Africa. Stuart Hall calls this an example of imaginary reunification, but what does it mean? It means that Arvid Francis does this photographing thing because he has this Africa as a center in his mind. So he goes to different places like diasporas and take pictures of these people that were dispersed in order for the hope of reconstructing, at least in visual terms, what was once a unified Africa. And then this definition, which Arvid Francis is a big fan of, shows the underlying unity of the black people whom colonization and slavery distributed across the African diaspora. And so if you look at this definition, the one he gives here, like one shared culture and stuff, if we look at it very closely, it gets really tricky because on one hand we have the black identity with a shared history of slavery and colonization, but on the other hand we have Africa. Africa is a vast region with a lot of different tribes, groups of people, practicing different religions, speaking different languages, even being colonized by different power. So it gets a little bit tricky. So Hall comes up here and says, how can we untangle these threads? And then he comes up with his own definition of cultural identity. He says, perhaps instead of thinking of identity as an already accomplished fact, we should think instead of identity as a production, which is never complete, always in process, and always constituted within, not outside representation. And he refers to this as becoming. He doesn't reject the being he already talked about, but he says like it's more becoming rather than being. And also he doesn't reject the similarities which was the main focus of the other definition. But then he says like let's have that, but let's highlight the differences here rather than similarity. And in order to come up with this definition, he brings in Frantz Fanon, who talks about black skin, white mask. Frantz Fanon talks about the psychological impact of colonization. He talks about how it messes with the mind rather than physical aspect. So he says, by kind of perverted logic, it turns to the past of oppressed people and distorts, disfigures, and destroys it. And here, he uses Edward Said's the idea of the other. He says, like, they force people, the colonized people, in order to see themselves through the eyes of colonizers as the other. And that's where Edward Said comes up. But, as if it's not bad enough, the worst part is that we have Michel Foucault here and his binary opposition of power and knowledge. It says like the worst part is that the colonized people believe these things, so it becomes a form of internal knowledge rather than external. So he says like subject them by power of inner compulsion and subjective conformation to the norm. Here, what he means is that the colonized people kind of help the colonizers to colonize them. They believe the labels that they put on themselves. And then the other person is Jacques Derrida. He uses the idea of difference. So we have the binary opposition of similarity and difference when it comes to cultural identity. Hall uses this binary position because Jacques Derrida is very famous for disrupting fixed binary oppositions. He says like we have similarities, but at the same time we have differences. We have that black shared identity, but at the same time African people are diverse and very different from one another. The other idea that Jacques Derrida proposes is that meaning is a chain of endless meaning. Like we don't have a fixed meaning. And sometimes, in order to understand things, because we don't have a fixed meaning, we have to pause, we have to take a break, and then kind of give specific meanings to words in order to understand them in a specific context. And what's its role in cultural identity? Stuart Hall proposes that in cultural identity we have something like positioning, which is completely the opposite side of the fixed essence. So we don't have Black identity as something fixed. It's always changing because we are in the position of we are defined in terms of positioning, which is one of the things that colonizers do to colonize. And the second concept that he brings in is the three key presences. He says that these three presences define the Blackness, the negritude. So these three presences are African, European, American, the New World. So the African one, he says, is kind of invisible. It's repressed. It's silent. Because slavery and colonization, which is two major, like, big things in Black history, they tried their best to kind of erase any direct connection to Africa. So if they wanted to practice their Africanness, it should have been silent. And you can see that in the way that they speak. So, for example, Algeria was colonized by French people. They speak French, but the way that they speak French is totally different from French people. It's the African presence in their culture. And in this time, like in the 1950s, we had rediscovery of African identity, so many Back to Africa movement. But Stuart Hall explains that the Back to Africa movement is not literal. So there is no homeland. It's kind of metaphorical because of this slavery and kind of colonization, we don't have the Africa anymore. So whatever it goes back there, it's a form of imagined community, and it's a kind of creative force that lets people to acknowledge the influence of colonizers, but at the same time produce creatively a new identity that includes both past and present. The other presence is European. It's more visible compared to African presence. It's about dominance and power, and it's about how colonizers kind of colonize these people. What they do is that they make stereotypes out of people. So Hall's case study in this case is Caribbean identity. He talks about Caribbeanness, and he says like how colonizers created stereotypes out of these people, African people. So they make them one dimension flat, which is not Africa and African identity, Caribbean identity is a complex one. So that's what happens there. And the thing is, the important thing here, back to Frantz Fanon, is that they do not reject it. Like African people do not reject it. It's not a hate relationship towards the colonizers because it's kind of a mixture of hate and love, attraction and repulsion. It's kind of constant negotiation, push and pull, tension between the colonizers and the colonized. So they don't reject it, but they kind of actively shape their own identity in terms of that. And then the third presence is the American or the New World. He talks about America in a broader sense, like a melting pot in which all the all the cultures comes to the place. And one of his examples is that before Caribbeans, America colonized the indigenous people. So America has it in its history. So whenever Caribbean people want to think of those colonization time or slavery time, they have indigenous people as a point of reference. And this influences how they define themselves, how they define Caribbeanness or their own cultural identity. The last one is Hall's idea of diaspora, which is totally different from the common view towards diaspora. he says that we have to use cultural strategies. And by cultural strategies, I'm going to explain, because he has third cinema as his example. He says, like, we have to move from Hollywood, we have to move from European cinema and move toward a third cinema in which people can actually present themselves in it. So there are ways in order to subvert and reappropriate the dominant narratives of colonizers and reclaim their own voice. So it's not a passive resistance, but they are actively shaping their own identity in a very limited context that colonizers provided for them. So unlike other people, Hall doesn't see diaspora as a negative concept. He sees this as an opportunity, which can enrich both their past, Caribbean past, as a point of colonization and slavery, and also their new generation, which are who are living in current time. He says diaspora identities are those which are constantly producing and reproducing themselves anew through transformation and difference. And this is how he talks about identity in motion, as becoming rather than being. And so he talked about cinema, and here I want to show you a video clip of Miles Davis, which is one of, unlike Adorno, he really liked jazz. So and his theory is totally, you can see his theory in this music. Because jazz is music of African people, right? The black people. And what happens there is that they don't reject the American or European influence on them. They don't reject their history of colonization and slavery. So when you listen to jazz, you hear the tempo, the rhythm, the drum that Adorno hates, which is a feature of African or black music. But at the same time, you also see the influence of other influences like colonizers. And I'm not going to show you the 10-minute video clip, just a few seconds. My point is clear. I just wanted to show like how jazz can be an alternative to his theory. And now we come up to my question of these studies. Like the first, okay, I included that meme there because it's how colonizers colonize people. They make stereotypes. So when I'm talking about Caribbean, the first thing that comes to my mind is the pirate of Caribbean, Johnny Depp as Jack Sparrow. So the first question is that he gives the example of cinema, third cinema. I showed you the music example, but how this theory is actually reflected in literature? And the other two questions, I did that on purpose because we are talking about this subject from the point of view of colonized people. Stuart Hall is a black person and he's talking from his own side, but let's look at it from colonizers. Like the second question is about bad colonizers. So the people who still want to colonize people. So how do you think that they react towards this theory? Because what Stuart Hall is proposing is quite practical. What would be the potential reaction of colonizers to this one? And the third one is about good colonizers, those who really want to change their attitude. They want to reshape their values, aesthetics, and move towards a more inclusive one. How can they possibly do this using theory of Stuart Hall? I'm done. That's finished.
Okay, thank you. Okay, great.
Should I hold it?
It's okay. I am going to turn it off just because it's in my eyes. So. Okay. All right, great. So yeah, I'm glad we did this essay first, and then the other one is sort of like a more methods essay about what he's doing. And they work nicely together. So Tina just guided us nicely through some of the main things that are going on, and I just think it's well said. Let's point out that, okay, it's the 1970s, 1980s, and Stuart Hall, and so cultural studies now is a field. Basically, he's one of the inventors of it in the 70s, I can't remember what his training was in. This will probably tell. Sociology, maybe? I don't know. Political theory. I'm curious, actually. Doesn't actually say. Oh well. But he essentially established his own department of cultural studies in Birmingham, famously, England. And so the Birmingham School, sometimes it's called. It's really, again, the first program to do cultural studies. So it's like what we talked about, the birth of the English department and its story and, travels. Basically, another department got invented in the 1970s saying, wait a second, we're not exactly English, we're not close reading literature, we're going to close read kind of all the rest of art and culture. Now, cultural studies has been folded back into the English department by and large, although other programs run it too, like media studies, or certainly visual art has a role in that. Basically, cultural studies is now kind of everybody's department in the humanities. But in a way, it had to be invented, and the moment of the 1970s it's happening. It's in some sense, it's convergence of many historical things that we've already kind of described, like the explosion of pop culture, and like different levels of culture. I would say, not just pop, which we might associate with mass culture. So we might have mass culture, high culture, and I don't think that model works anymore. That was like the modernist model. Jameson would say that too. Well, by the 70s, where everything is sort of mixed. Jazz, Miles Davis. He can write film scores for Hollywood cinema. He can write avant-garde music that only some people might like. He can write hugely popular music. Like, think of Quincy Jones, I think, who just passed away, is a great example of very new jazz, but also very popular stuff. He can produce super pop hits, or with Michael Jackson, or he can do artists doing their own thing and experimenting with different stuff. The point is that a lot of that modernist cultural theory is not working. Okay, high-low doesn't really fit there. You can call it cultural and industry stuff, but as we know, as brilliant as Adorno is, you get stuck with that. It feels a bit of a dead end sometimes. And so in the 1970s, you have people making their own art, doing exactly what we said. How do you escape the culture industry? Well, let's make your own art. If you're Miles Davis, go ahead and make your own jazz, or make your own photography, and so on. And people from Jamaica are doing that, or people from places that didn't get access, I would say, either to high culture or to mass culture. So they created their own thing, which is, I don't know what we call that exactly, but just new culture, let's call it. What is the theory that would understand that? That's what Stuart Hall is doing. So things like he certainly studied Jamaican music, reggae, and then rap. So Stuart Hall wrote on the emergence of rap in the 80s. What is that? It does come from the people, and has a kind of I don't know if the right word is populist, but it has a kind of it comes out of the people not trying to, like, prior to the culture industry. It was not made by the culture industry, rap music. Of course, it quickly got co-opted into the studio system of producing records and so on. But at first, it wasn't that. So how do we understand it as this sort of bubbling up of creative potential of like black community in New York City, something like that. So what are the theory tools we need to do that? That's cultural studies. As this essay says, we're like, well, what the heck is Caribbean cinema? From the get-go. That's the opening question. How does it position itself in cultural systems? That's a very like Roland Barthes style question, or it's Adorno or other people, but also how does it sort of change let's say status of art, the art, the producer of that art, and the culture that receives that art, because there can be changes. It's not just Hollywood producing mass culture for the work system. These are now Jamaican filmmakers producing art for themselves and for their community. So it's something different. It needs a different theory. Let's see. I think Tina did a great job of sketching some of the sort of theory side of identity, theorizing identity in this essay. And so Stuart Hall is also trying to be very careful of trying to use, as Tina pointed out, some of the theorists, the post-structural theorists who were thinking about the mobility of identity, the construction of identity through difference, also through issues of race like Fanon, and geography maybe, or colonialism through Said and so on. And this comes together in this cultural studies method in which I think it is a bit of a critique of the previous generation, whether they were formalist or Marxist. They had, it's an obvious problem for like Derrida and let's say post-structuralist formalism, because their canon is very limited. Again, it's largely white men that they're reading. And they missed the question of, like, where do people read this? Where, like, the location? Who are the writers? It does kind of matter if you're doing, let's say, Racine, or if you're doing, like, V.S. Naipaul. Or if you are reading Chinua Achebe, or if you are reading Joseph Conrad. I mean, that's a big debate right there. So if you're just reducing it all to the play of the signifier, you're missing what these cultural works are doing. So it was a criticism against the generation. So again, it's the 70s and 80s, and even if the rise of theory is doing one thing in terms of of post-structuralism and demand, it is still missing so much of what should be read. And cultural studies is starting to push it towards that direction. And it's also pushing against, let's say, Marxism again by saying that structure was too rigid. Right? The base superstructure thing, it always turned culture into something back, like, into the economic. To some extent, Adorno is doing that in that essay. He's turning all of cultural production into the culture industry, and not really willing to read against that to some extent. I mean, he's a bit savvier than just being a simple Marxist, but Stuart Hall is just trying to figure out, how do people make culture as an active thing that may not necessarily be mass culture, or but is very situated in places, among peoples, has a history, and can induce change. All the things we're kind of searching for. And this is, again, it also fits the 1970s, 80s moment where culture becomes the thing that is politics now. We live in an era in which that's very obvious. We do culture politics. We may not change the economic system, but we can change the cultural system. So we will battle over cultural politics, constantly. Jamaica is still capitalist. That's not going to change and some people think this is a big step backwards. So there's, like, for example, someone named like Bruce Robbins, or these are well-known theorists today. Actually, the big guy who says this over and over again is Walter Ben Michaels. These are sort of a generation. They're all about 70 years old. And a lot of their arguments were like, class is the one thing that drops out. As the canon gets multicultural as cultural studies takes over the English department, the one thing that we all stop talking about is changing capitalism. And I think they're right, actually, but they also miss the fact that there's a lot of politicization going around in the cultural objects. And they were criticizing Marx for doing the opposite, constantly thinking of class and not understanding cultural objects on there as doing historical change. So Stuart Hall's trying to do both. He really is a Marxist, actually. And he really is, let's say, post-colonialist and a scholar of black studies and cultural, I say freedoms, I think is the right word for that. He really is, he does care about all the above. And he's trying to create a method that will do that. I will say a lot of cultural studies today does drop out, again, even what Stuart Hall was doing, which is the Marxist stuff. And you'll see it here and there in some of these essays. I don't know, it's not as strong maybe in this cultural identity and diaspora, but I think it is actually. So let me just, the last few highlights, and we'll get to the other one too. Of this essay, let's see. I mean, as he says on 223, so I'll go quicker here, given that Tina has done all the good highlights. But on 223, he says, so artwork is, he says, conception of cultural identity played a crucial role in the post-colonial struggles which have profoundly shaped our world. So cultural identity, cultural production is part of the post-colonial struggle. So it's a political, culture and politics connection. You might not say it's a Marx thing, but I think it does connect with Marx. Let's see. Another way it connects with Marx, even in what Tina's presented, is the next phrasing is 224. The question he asks is culture like only a matter of unearthing that which the colonial experience buried and overlaid, bringing to light the hidden continuities it suppressed, or is it quite different practice entailed not the rediscovery but the production of identity? And I highlight the word production because that's Marx is all about, changing the mode of production, becoming a producer, owning the means of production. That's what would change the capitalist system. If you could be the producer and own the means of production. Well, guess what? You can do that culturally. This is what he's using his Marxist tools to theorize Jamaican black cinematic production. And saying these are producers. Someone who has shown that model as well would have been Walter Benjamin. He has an essay called Author as Producer. But the point is that I think Hall is quite serious that there is, that word matters. Producing, the process of identity, the production of identity, creation of identity. These are somewhat technical terms too. So as Tina did show, one of the things that is going on with specifically Black or Caribbean art is this relationship to Africa, to what Stuart Hall calls an imagined plenitude, also sometimes an imagined community, that there's a cultural difference in this artwork that is trying to create a sense of that, of Africa as a full place rather than an emptied out place or a stereotype place. But that doesn't, you can't do that on the historical instant. You have to do it through like the mediation of cultural art. Cultural art can reconstruct that because history it's lost to some degree. I mean, that's overstating it, but in the immediate historical present, it's not a plenitude as such. But in art, it could be. And then art showing the plenitude might create that plenitude in Africa or in Jamaica or in New York City or something like that. So the imaginary plenitude might actually transform itself into social plenitude. And so to me, these are Marxist processes, but also specific to, let's say, Black experience in Jamaica or New York or wherever it is. And that's why Hall is being very sophisticated. Okay, so other than that, as Tina pointed out, that the identity is for Stuart Hall not something fixed, it's something made, he says on 226. it has a history, it has material and symbolic effects, it's constructed through memory, fantasy, narrative, and myth. It's not an essence, though, but a positioning. Right? It doesn't have no position, or it's not like in deconstruction where the positions are constantly in play. Yes, they are in play, but because there is historical connectivity to that. That's part of how they get put into play, through things like connectivity, memory, narrative, and so on. This is an example of what we would call post-foundational thinking. So, after Derrida and others, this argument that essentializing is bad thinking, it's just not even true, like in terms of the concept. No, like there are essentials were always dependent on things like the prosthetic or the supplement or the excluded thing that created the essentialized object, but in fact was inside the essentialized thing all along. So Stuart Hall is smart enough to know that that's not what identity is, but it's, as he goes on to say, identity is like a hybrid thing. It can tolerate all sorts of mixings and borrowings. As Tina showed, there's présence africaine, présence européenne, présence américaine, just use the French there, in all Caribbean culture. So this is a hybridization model rather than an essentialist model. So it's not Jamaicans only because it's there's a true Jamaicanness that all Jamaicans must sort of find in themselves and keep as such. But like whatever true Jamaicanness is already kind of hybridization or creolization of various influences. Not all of them good, but all of them negotiated into identity. So it just resonates for today when sometimes people do say things like, one needs to get back to an essential whatever, American identity or French identity or Canadian identity or whatever. We know all along that none of those identities were pure or fixed once and for all, even back in the day. They were always hybrid from the get-go, and so purity arguments are easy to deconstruct, but on the other hand, like they still seem to work. They are still circulated out there, and Stuart Hall and the cultural studies movement is to try and get away from that. And so it's pretty clear that his work is not trying to say, okay, there's an African identity and a Jamaican identity, an American identity, and indigenous identity, and these are fixed and they don't have any overlaps, and it's a sort of separatist model. It's not that at all. Okay, I think probably that's enough for this article. In the other Stuart Hall one, he gives you a sort of self-theory method of cultural studies and its theoretical legacies. He says on 1705 that he offers some reflections on cultural studies as a practice, on our institutional position, on his project, and theoretical legacies, and so on. On the next page, he says the following. Cultural studies is a discursive formation in some sense. It has no simple origins. A little bit later in that paragraph, he says it has a number of different, cultural studies has multiple discourses, it has a number of different theories, it is a whole set of formations, it has its own different conjunctures and moments in the past, it includes many different kinds of work. And my question for you is, it was always a set of unstable formations. It was centered only in quotation marks. It has many trajectories. Many people had and have different trajectories through it. it was constructed by a number of different methodologies and theoretical positions, all of them conditional. Why do you think he's emphasizing that from the outset? Why this heavy use of multiplicity, multiple confluences, and so on? Why the emphasis? What do you think he's doing there by starting with that?
It kind of seems to me like he thinks of multiplicity as part of like the defining element of the field.
Yeah.
So you have to emphasize that it has multiple roots and multiple sources,
Yeah.
so that you can also emphasize that the point of it is to reverse this multiplicity.
Exactly. Yeah. So we're in a moment of the 1980s. This is late 80s, early 90s of methodological multiplicity, kind of like the syllabus that we have, and Stuart Hall's saying that's a good thing. That and cultural studies is going to build on it and build with it, if you will, build with the multiplicity. Okay. Other reasons why he's emphasizing this.
Is this said in Wikipedia or somewhere that Stuart Hall was the father of multiculturalism?
That's I think right. I think
Yeah.
not. I wouldn't call him the father of it, but
Somewhere is said.
But invested in it. So multiple methods, multiplicity of methodologies responds to multicultural world. So you can't have one method for a multiple world, like a multi-identity world. You have to have multiple methods for the multiplicity of the world. Okay, the methods are going to match the objects. The objects turn out to be everything. Well, if we're studying everything from rap music to photography to plastic to Miles Davis to Andy Warhol and so on, well, we're going to need a multiplicity of methods, and cultural studies will embrace that. Embrace it as multiple. And yes, we could return back to our semiotics and sort of say, like, no, we need grounding. We need one method, because that's you have kind of two options. You have multiple methods and multiple objects, or you have one method and multiple objects. Well, I don't know. Stuart Hall is kind of like saying he preferred the first example, but he does use semiotics. He's not throwing away like the formalism and that kind of stability of some of these methods either. But the reason I asked this as a question is I think it's quite obvious. So these 2 points Sarah and Keaton were saying is that one needs to be able to borrow from methods, but like essentially how identities were shaped were multiple borrowings. That's called creolization. So if creolization was how identities form, your theory will be sort of a creolization, because you're going to have to borrow from different theories to understand identity formation or cultural formation. And of course, you're going to have to understand the multiplicity of those cultures too, through multiple methods. So it's very powerful. It is the English department. Like, you know, we do believe in formalism, and we do believe in multiplicity and cultural multiplicity. That should embrace a kind of flexible methodology that is being offered here. It's flexible, but it still has, again, as I said, it's sort of semiotic and it's Marxist kind of edges to it. And it's Fanon sort of post-colonial edges. Okay, well, what else does he tell us about his method? Switch classes, he says, next paragraph, it says, now, does it follow that cultural studies is not a police disciplinary area? That is, whatever people do, if they choose to call or locate themselves within the project and practice of cultural studies? I'm not happy with that formulation either. Although cultural studies as a project is open-ended, it can't simply be pluralist in that way. Yes, it refuses to be a master discourse or a meta-discourse of any kind. Yes, it is a project that is always open to that which it doesn't yet know, to which it can't yet name. But it does have some will to connect. It does have some stakes in the choices it makes. It does matter whether cultural studies is this or that. It just can't be any old thing which chooses to march under a particular banner. It is a serious enterprise or project, and it's described in what sometimes is called the political. Not that there's one politics already inscribed in it. But there is something at stake in cultural studies. In a way, that I think and I hope is not exactly true of many other important intellectual and critical practices. Here one registers the tension between a refusal to close the field, to police it, and at the same time, determination to stake out some positions within it and argue for them. That is the tension, the dialogical approach to theory. I would call it dialectics, if you will. And I want to try to speak in a number of different ways to the course. Okay, so that paragraph should be very resonant for us, I would think, what I just read. But I'll ask you, what is he negotiating here exactly? To me, that is such a fascinating paragraph, set of sentences about what he's doing. I ask you, what's he navigating? How is he trying to sort of thread the needle of cultural studies?
Well, I think it feels like he's dealing with the thing that a lot of us feel in the university when we're asked, what's our methodology, what are you doing?
Yeah.
And if you give more than like 3 answers, it's like, oh, you gotta narrow that. It's like, ooh, you gotta pick something and stick with it. So that you know that thing super well. Yeah. And you're like, but that like, it feels limiting. It's like, you can be serious and have an objective and have a vision without, killing all your darlings, as it were.
Yeah. He says it does matter whether cultural studies is this or that. It can't be everything, even though I did maybe overstate the case that we can close read anything. Like he's going to do artworks. He's really not close reading plastic at the end of the day. Like that's not what Stuart Hall does. So it has to be. He is reading culture, and probably he's not. He's going to stop at like you could make the case that you could read commercials. As culture. I mean, it's pretty low, bottom of the barrel stuff. Maybe I should I don't know, sitcoms. Like that's very easy mass culture stuff. I don't think he's going to spend his time doing that. Like he thinks the cultural object, it's got to be Miles Davis. It's got to be good art, a little bit of good art. Like yes, you could read pop culture and so on. I don't think he's going to waste his time doing that. So he really wants the culture to do some, as he says, political work for us. But he wants to be open-ended to what that object and what that work would be. Okay, so I'll just keep asking, or maybe one more, if anyone wants to jump in, a little bit about this paragraph and how other needles that he's threading in terms of the conversations that we're talking about. All right, how do you see him? Imagine he's been in this class, and he's been through all the debates that we have had, and his answer to that is his version of cultural studies, which, how does it navigate some of these Scylla and Charybdis situations that we've said, too many methods, one method, we've talked about that so far, too many objects, one object, maybe a similar thing. Sarah, what else?
I think there's also the attention that he has just kind of after that where he talks about positionality, right? Like the other tension is like you have to choose a position, you have to take a stance on something while also being open to the possibility that it will change, right?
Yeah. Nice.
Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. So how do you pick a politics with and make political claims and stakes for your work at the same time? And that seems recognizable, let's say, a Marxist model, or it could be feminist, whatever. I'm just using Marx as like my synecdoche here throughout this class. But how do you not be stuck in what that politics says you should think is important all the time, only? Politics changes, situations change. And how do you stay political in the political tradition, but be open to political change or other developments in politics, we might say. And also cultural newness, because if you're always saying, oh, well, that Miles Davis, it's just like that thing 10 years ago, or something like that, it's just like the politics of Beethoven. That's just tedious. So how do you give the object a little bit of its open, I guess the word again, new or sort of its own emergence into the cultural kind of situation, it's due. At the same time, you rethink that into the longer kind of situation of culture and politics. And as I was saying, he's threading the needle or navigating the Scylla and Charybdis of all these debates we're having and coming up with a very savvy and clever method to do that. Like he's like, okay, we need a multiplicity of identity, but it's not just like you just pick whatever you want. That's not what identity means for him. Like there's histories and and as he says, fantasies and myths and narratives and so on. So there should be some sense you can produce your own identity and culture. On the other hand, there's histories to that production. Like autonomy versus, let's say, history or context or something like that. So I think, let's see if I can add any more interesting things here. He positions this, he says this is what we have to do, basically, now that we're in this era of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, sort of the new left and after, when the breakdown of these large political projects, and I want to say large cultural projects, are done. Like we no longer think modernist art's going to save the world. We no longer think, let's say, modernist politics, whether that be, again, Marx or maybe even something like feminism or whatever. These like large-scale political projects, we no longer think they alone will change the world on their own. Okay, so we're in a point in which we may need multiple politics, multiple methods, multiple objects, multiple ways of being open to the effects of these things, multiple resistances, as he says on that page 1707, as a kind of combination effect, and that is called cultural studies. All right. Again, on the next page, 1708, he's criticizing Marxism for not being multiple in that way, for being a little too fixed and Eurocentric, and there were fixed laws of history in Marx, and so on, and that is a limited model in his view. He does, though, go on to say that on 1709 that Marx and cultural studies are not exactly just the synthesis of the two. He says there's an interesting tension between the two. It's just, if you're really into technical stuff about cultural studies, you can enjoy that. I think the thing, maybe lastly, I would say is, what is then the role of the cultural theorist in all this? So I will ask us as a group and say it's one thing to theorize the object and to understand the object better and to understand identities better. What is the role of the theorist? So it's not necessarily the art maker, and it's not exactly, let's say, the citizen, although it could be, I suppose, like the Jamaican person. What is the role of the cultural theorist, cultural studies theorist, let's say? As using Stuart Hall as an example, or using this particular essay as an example, or just in your own view. How is it the same thing as the literary theorist? Is it the same thing as some of the examples we've had that psychoanalysis, feminism, cultural studies theorist is what in that schema of it, in your view? What is their role? Is it basically similar to all these other theorists, or does it have anything else it's doing?
Maybe thinking back to the Barth's article on plastic. Maybe the theorist's job is to make the boundaries around a concept or fixed idea become more blurry. To me, Barth didn't make plastic seem more specific. He made plastic seem more abstract and connected to everything.
Uh-huh.
And I guess that image came into mind when Stuart Hall says a refusal to close the field. So the image for me is also a circle.
Yeah, that's good. And Bart, by the way, thought that one of the roles of the cultural theorist why he calls it myth. He says myth is the naturalization of an object, or the forgetting of its history, the forgetting of how it was made and produced and circulated and turned into a cultural thing. So the job of the cultural theorist is to undo that myth by saying, let's theorize, where does this thing come from? What's it made out of? Who made it? And to not take it as myth, not take it as, let's just say, appearing in the world from nowhere, and just there to be consumed, That's the everyday approach to the world, but the cultural theorist is to give that object back its history and story and who made it and so on. And yeah, I think it's, okay, so far so good. This should be slightly different than I think a literary theorist to some extent. Although literary theory does that too. I don't know if we read Keats to do, give that back to Keats per se. It's not exactly what we're doing when we're reading the poem and the metaphor. So, okay, so far so good. What else then?
I want to say a cultural theories is different to literary theories in a way that as a literary theorist, we can actually read a lot of literature, but cultural theories are specific. So I can never talk about Stuart Hall. I didn't experience blackness. I didn't experience colonization in a way that they were subjected to because there were so intricacies in that.
Yeah.
So I think that they should be a good observer. Their role is that they should be a good observer of their own culture and then pinpoint to these influences or traces and then make it generalize it in order to make other cultures aware of what is happening. Because it's impossible to know about all the cultures.
Well, I think that's right. Theorizing is that, and we also just can call it reading generally, but is that, again, navigation of these things, which is the cultural specific object, okay, but the theorist may not be the same as the maker of the object. So they don't want to totally dislocate the object into, let's say, the world of theory and abstraction. So you want to place it, position it. On the other hand, you need to connect that to other stories that have, I would, do other work that Stuart Hall called things like, this imaginary plenitude thing. That describes the English department. It's a place of imaginary plenitude. And the theorist is there to position those objects in that sense of other plenitudes. Maybe they are in terms of identity or citizenship or just recognition or other practices in which affirmation and world creation are supported. So that allows the theorist to sort of move between these things, which is what, again, the Stuart Hall cultural studies methodology is trying to invent, very conscientiously, and I think very carefully. I think we do often forget that there was a whole theory to this project. It wasn't just pick a random cultural object, put some theory on it, and that's it. There was a real emphasis here that this would be a model forward in how we negotiate with each other, how we do theory, how we get out of some of the impasses of the English department, how we turn it into a multicultural, multi-object place, multi-method place. Sarah, do you want to add?
Yeah, I think kind of related to that, one of the things that stood out to me in this discussion is his discussion of the organic intellectual.
Yeah.
Where it's there are two things that you're supposed to do. One is know things, and the other is transmit them to a non-academic audience.
Yeah.
And I think that seems kind of to be one of the things that's central to his idea of what the goal of the field is, and I think stood out to me because it is a balance. It's not just about having knowledge or creating knowledge and keeping it in one place.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's also there's a dimension in which you have an obligation to transmit it as well.
Yeah. And that's the theorist is the one who negotiates between the people and the university or the academic world. That's another cylinder of this. So the cultural object may on rare occasion come from the university, but probably doesn't. It comes from outside the university. So anyways, the point is that the theorist is going to do that mediating work. So, and it's not just to bring the art into the university. It's also to bring the university back out into the public, into the world of producers and consumers of art, the world of culture, which is all of us. That's the organic intellectual. It's a slightly variation of the theorization. It originally comes from Gramsci, and it's sort of mediating between the party and the sort of history of Marx and then the actual daily life of workers and so on. The organic intellectual was able to do both, right, and not be stuck either on the side of just writing textbooks, Capital over and over again, but also being able to sort of be part of the people and part of the theory at the same time. So but the same model is appropriate for this cultural studies thinker. This is an early version of public humanities, cultural studies. Like Derrida, well, he is a kind of public intellectual to some degree, isn't theorizing it so much. He's just a great philosopher, and everyone should just listen to him as such. But he hasn't really theorized his relation to mediating, let's say, the university and cultural movements at large. I mean, Jameson does do some of this to some extent, but this is a thing that has to be done in the 80s and 90s, and now we have the legacy of that as an ongoing conversation. Sometimes we call that public humanities. We could also call it cultural studies. I mean, these are practices that developed in a certain moment that I think are still with us. Okay, so that's basically, I think we're still kind of on schedule, actually. Enough for 10 minutes of one last thing, which, but I hope you enjoyed that Stuart Hall conversation. And I think it'll carry over to critical race theory, colonialism, and so on in the next weeks. As for Hall, it's not like navigating the Scylla and Charybdis always works out perfectly. Yeah, as he says, it's about there will be tensions, and it's actually kind of about making that productive, making those tensions productive, not just saying, "Oh, we'll smush it all into one thing," Apple style. Compress it into the iPod of the English department. But he understood that there will be bumps along the way, and there will be tensions or conflicts, maybe that's the right word, or so on. Okay, well, anyways, a very different kind of cultural studies was generated. This text is about 15 years old, but I thought it's fun to just see at least a little bit of 21st century methods by Jane Bennett. This is on 2434, Vibrant Matter. So Jane Bennett is an American academic, and she comes at 2324. What did I say? 2434. Yeah. She is writing. This is early 2000s when this comes out, and I suppose this kind of opens up another sort of moment in 2010 of like the problems with the state of the English department and the impasses and so on. And Bennett, she's actually more a political theorist than an English department person, but that's fine. And one of the impasses was sort of like, well, we did cultural studies, and the world didn't change. It's 2010. We all became Stuart Hall acolytes. We love cultural studies, and we're still kind of stuck with the same problems, right? Like, yes, you can make your own art, and yes, we can theorize it and give you a sense of that sort of like identitarian change that goes along with it. You can find hybridities anywhere you look and celebrate them and so on. Has that changed politics? That's one big question we have to ask. And I think it has to some degree, but maybe it also has reached a certain impasse as we see today. And the other thing is, has it changed has it generated as much methodological inventiveness as one would have hoped? That's more the second thing, is really more where Jane Bennett comes in. Her work kind of is part of a trend we might call thing theory. At the time, very popular at the moment, from like 2005, I think up till today to some degree, but was trying to do a little bit different thing than just cultural studies was doing. And it was to understand the materiality a little bit better of objects. As having something meaningful that wasn't just explained by let's say, cultural studies model, and certainly not explained by other models either, including Marx and so on. And what's her presentation instead? It's just that basically things they tell their own stories. They have their own powers. They have their own points of view. It's kind of, as she says later on, this is essentially an extension of anthropomorphism as a method for understanding objects, whether they be cultural objects or just any particular object. like a glove, as she says. So I'll read a little bit and then say a few things here. So she says on 2435, she says, in what follows, I too will feature the negative power or recalcitrance of things, but I also seek to highlight a positive, productive power of their own. She'll call that thing power. She says it's kind of the moment when the object looks back. The sardine can looks back. That's a reference to Lacan. Anyways, other things she points out is that Spinoza has an interesting theory that every body has a power to it, what's called a conatus. It's a little bit technical stuff, but it's an interesting source of the argument. That every object, everything in the universe has its own power. Nietzsche, by the way, thought this was a great theory. He loved Spinoza. Okay, skipping a page here. She called it's a sense that objects have a vital quality to them. Or a vibrancy. So vibrant matter or a vital power. They are actants rather than, let's say, passive, inert things. So whatever object it has a vibrant, activated or actant, vital life, if that's the right word for that, potentiality in it. She calls this, at the bottom 2436, the strangely vital things will meet us in this chapter. She says on 2437 at the top there, a couple lines down, the hope is that the story will enhance receptivity to the impersonal life that surrounds us and infuses us, will generate a more subtle awareness of the complicated web of dissonant connections between bodies, and will enable wiser interventions into that ecology. So this is also a sort of little bit of an early ecological method as well, Jane Bennett. So then she says the following. On a Sunday, Tuesday morning on 4th of June in the grate over the storm drain in the Chesapeake Bay in front of the Sam's Bagels, Cold Spring Lane in Baltimore. So we're in Baltimore. Okay. We see the following. 1 large men's black plastic work glove, 1 dense mat of oak pollen, 1 unblemished dead rat, 1 white plastic bottle cap, 1 smooth stick of wood. Glove, pollen, rat, cap, stick. As I encountered these items, they shimmied back and forth in the debris. I'm just going to skip a little here. Go fast. Stuff that commanded attention in its own right, as existence in excess of their association with human meanings, habits, or projects. So these things issued a call, even if I did not quite understand what it was saying. At the very least, provoked affects in me. I was repelled by the dead rat, dismayed by the litter, felt something else, a nameless awareness of the impossible singularity of that rat, that pollen, that banal plastic water bottle cap. And that's kind of it's kind of an interesting scene that people have referred to over and over in Bennett's work, this little scene of this garbage, basically. And I'm just going to pause here and ask you, what's going on? Why do you think, what's the epiphany here? What is she seeing in this collection of garbage in Baltimore that is going to do something for her and essentially require a little bit of a new method? What's the epiphany? Well, she's looking at garbage, right? It's not exactly what we look at as in the English department, but what's the epiphany that she's having? I think this will translate. She does go on to read Kafka. Essentially Kafka's garbage, but it's a famous story. I think it's called The Cares of a Family Man, if I got that right. Odradek? You know that Kafka? I think it's called The Cares of a Family Man, is it? Anyways, it's one of my favorite Kafka stories. Have you all read that one? Where there's this little, Walter Benjamin loves this story. Walter Benjamin's favorite story. There's this little sort of stick, spool, thread thing. It's got a leaf stuck in it too. And so it's this little object. It lives under the staircase, it would seem, of this guy's house. It laughs at him, it speaks, but in sort of slightly cryptic ways. And it just haunts this character. And it's only like 2 pages long story. It just haunts the person who lives in this apartment. And he says, like one of the reasons it haunts him is because he realizes this stupid object is going to outlive him. And so it's sort of fascinating and terrifying to him, this Kafka story. Well, anyways, Bennett is having a Kafka moment with this garbage in Baltimore. Why? What's the epiphany?
Whenever I read this part, I get reminded of Malone Dies by Beckett. There's all this garbage in his old man's room, and he looks at them, and it's as if all that garbage has like an agency of its own.
Yeah.
So what I'm getting is that somehow the epiphany is that these objects are existing without me being like the creator or the maker or the one who gives meaning to them. So it is this moment that you realize that these things could have an ontology of their own.
Yeah.
But at the same time, using the term vitality is making it very anthropocentric. So although we are, like the experience, the feeling that we get is telling us that, you know what, you're not the center, this might be the center, but at the same time, the way we want to describe it, there is no way but to describe it from the center, which is our perception and our experience of that moment.
I agree. Yeah, that's another, I mean, these are classic Scylla and Charybdis, that's a metaphor for today, of trying to negotiate that. So she's exactly thinking the same thing. She admits that she's doing a little bit of projection, anthropomorphizing, and so on. So maybe these things are only important to us. But she also says, at the same time, they do seem to have their own ontologies or their own vibrancies, whether or not she saw them as objects, whether or not it was her or someone else or any human present. They seem to have a story, a meaning. So yes, it's partly because we encounter them, but also she's trying to give them their own thing, their own space too, to some degree. And sort of like the thing theory or vibrant matter theory is the meeting of those two encounters. This method is obviously resonant for ecology, where you're trying to not always, let the animal have its existence, let the river have its existence, let the tree have its own story that it offers. So it is very helpful and prescient in that, but it could be also, it doesn't have to be green things like that. It could be trash. Like, ecology is about reading trash and plastic and dead bottle caps or so on and so forth. So there's epiphanies, we might call it ecological going on here. Dakota?
Yeah, I was going to draw both of those together. Thinking about Don Mackay has a poem. He's a Canadian poet, early eco-poet. Yeah. And in it, he says something about how when you leave your possessions, they go slowly wild, which is kind of melding those two ideas together, that recognizing the otherness in them, and also that it is an act of the human to condense them down into the way that we want to see them, that eventually they shake from that.
Yeah. So I think, and that's, to me, also resonant with the history of cultural studies, that the otherness that you're not trying to subsume all the time. The sort of, the shimmering of the otherness in the thing is something that a theorist needs to sort of care for, attend to, and read in that sense, as caring, without subsuming that, without destroying the otherness of that thing. And that is very Kafka, and it's very Jane Bennett, and it's very Don Mackay. So while she could have been in our ego section, I think she also fits in the cultural studies, theorizing objects for how they are producing their worlds. I guess we'll leave it at that. But Daniel, last word?
Yeah, no, I was flipping back and forth between the post-human article we were reading and the last week, thinking about like
the same generation, same.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, because when you said the eco-preg post-human stuff, I started thinking that's. Yeah, I kind of see that in that. Yeah. This essay more in that school than
in a way. Like cultural studies has started to shift towards these like eco post-human questions more and more because as technology accelerates.
Yeah.
All right. I hope you do have some good rest. I see people have signed up. Basically, everybody signed up for in person. That's what I gather. That's fine. That's fine.
For that paper, do you want us to use just like the theories that are on the syllabus, or can we have some theories?
So for sure, at least one of the theorists you're talking about should be from the syllabus. Okay. But other theorists can be from your other interests. Okay. Yeah. So at least someone from the syllabus. But more is fine. Yeah. More of their own texts that are not on the syllabus. Yeah. So just a reminder then to send it to me the night before, preferably, or the morning of.